Imagine being lowered into a cauldron of boiling water. Your skin blistering, your screams echoing off stone walls as spectators watch in horror and fascination. This wasn't a scene from some medieval fiction or a nightmare. It was the grim reality for Richard Ruse in 1531. His execution remains one of the most shocking examples of judicial cruelty in history, ordered not by some barbaric warlord, but by one of England's most famous monarchs, King Henry VIII. The method was not chosen for spectacle, but as a specific form of justice that reflected the unique tensions and fears of Tudor England. The execution of Richard Ruse is more than just a gruesome historical footnote. It represents the brutal exercise of royal power during a pivotal moment in English history, at the intersection of politics and religion. Henry VIII England was a realm in transition, a place where the king's will was becoming supreme and where acts considered treasonous were met with increasingly horrific punishments. But why would boiling alive be deemed appropriate for anyone, especially a simple cook? What could this man have possibly done to warrant such an extreme sentence? To understand this dark chapter, we must journey back to a time when justice was often public, painful, and designed not just to punish the individual, but to send a message to all who might dare defy the crown. The tale of Richard Ruse offers us a window into the Tudor mind, a place where crime and punishment operated under principles far removed from our modern understanding of justice. His story serves as a stark reminder of how far our legal systems have evolved and perhaps how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. As we delve into this disturbing account, we'll explore not just how Ruse died, but why his death was deemed necessary by one of history's most powerful kings. We'll examine the political climate, the religious tensions, and the personal motivations that culminated in a punishment so severe it would eventually be outlawed, even in an era known for its cruelty. This is not simply a tale of horror. It's a lesson in power, fear, and the terrible consequences when both are wielded without mercy. The year was 1531, and the pot was literally about to boil over in Tudor England. King Henry VIII, not yet the corpulent tyrant of his later years, but already showing signs of the ruthlessness that would define his reign, was about to make an example of a royal cook in a way that would shock even his contemporaries. The simmering water in Smithfield, London, would soon become the instrument of one of history's most notorious executions, one that would stand as a grim testament to the extraordinary powers of England's most infamous monarch. To understand the full horror of Richard Ruse's execution, we must first understand the world in which it took place. England in the early 1530s was a powder keg of religious and political tension. Henry VIII, once celebrated as a Renaissance prince, had begun his transformation into the tyrannical figure remembered by history. His desperate quest for a male heir had led him to question his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, setting him on a collision course with the Catholic Church and plunging England into the turmoil of what would later be called the English Reformation. This was a time when the king's supremacy was being asserted with unprecedented force. Parliament had become a tool of royal power rather than a check on it. Laws were being rewritten to accommodate the king's desires, and those who stood in his way faced increasingly dire consequences. The old medieval order was crumbling, and in its place was rising a new concept of an all-powerful monarch answerable only to God, and increasingly interpreting God's will as identical to his own. Religious anxiety permeated every aspect of Tudor life. The spectre of heresy loomed large, with both traditional Catholics and emerging Protestant factions viewing each other with suspicion and fear. Poisoning particularly carried special horror in the Tudor mind, seen not just as murder but as a particularly treacherous and cowardly form of it, one associated with women, foreigners, and those too weak to confront their enemies openly. In a world where the king's body was considered sacred and semi-divine, any attack on the royal household through poison was viewed as not just a crime, but a sacrilege. London itself was a city of stark contrasts. Magnificent royal palaces stood not far from squalid slums, and the glittering pageantry of court life existed alongside public executions that drew crowds as large as any festival. Smithfield, where Ruse would meet his end, was already established as a place of punishment, particularly for religious dissenters who had been burned at the stake there. It was a place where the power of the state was demonstrated in the most visceral way possible, a theatre of justice where the condemned served as both cautionary example and public entertainment. In this volatile environment, the role of food taster or cook was one of surprising significance. Those who prepared meals for the powerful literally held their lives in their hands. A royal cook was a position of trust, and consequently betrayal by such a person was seen as particularly heinous. Richard Ruse served in the household of John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, a man who would later become a saint, but who was already walking a dangerous line as one of Queen Catherine's most outspoken defenders against Henry's desire for an annulment. Richard Ruse was not a figure of historical significance until the incident that would lead to his execution. He was a cook in the employ of Bishop John Fisher, one of the most respected religious figures in England and crucially a staunch supporter of Catherine of Aragon in her dispute with Henry VIII. Fisher had openly opposed the king's attempts to annul his marriage, making him a thorn in Henry's side during a period when the king was growing increasingly intolerant of opposition. The event that sealed Ruse's fate occurred on February 18, 1531, when several people in Bishop Fisher's household fell seriously ill after consuming porridge that Ruse had prepared. Two individuals, a man named Bennet Serwin and an unnamed poor woman who had been fed from the household's charity, died as a result. Bishop Fisher himself, who had reportedly eaten only a small amount of the porridge, became violently ill, but survived. The immediate suspicion was poison, and Ruse was quickly identified as the culprit. When questioned, Ruse allegedly admitted to adding a substance to the porridge, but claimed it was meant as a prank, a laxative intended to cause discomfort rather than death. This explanation did little to help his case. Whether he intended murder or merely mischief, tampering with food in a prominent household, particularly one with connections to the royal court, was viewed with the utmost seriousness. In an age before modern medicine, the line between harmful prank and deadly poisoning was perilously thin. The political implications of the incident were impossible to ignore. Bishop Fisher was not just any cleric, but a significant political opponent of the king's policies. While no direct evidence linked Ruse's actions to any plot against Fisher specifically, the timing was suspicious enough to raise questions about whether the cook might have been acting on someone else's orders. Was this a bungled assassination attempt, a warning, or truly just a prank gone horribly wrong? These questions still puzzle historians today. What is clear is that Henry VIII took a personal interest in the case. The king had been gradually consolidating power, working to bring both the church and the legal system under his direct control. The poisoning case presented an opportunity to demonstrate royal authority and to circumvent normal legal procedures in a way that would set a powerful precedent. Rather than allowing Ruse to be tried through ordinary legal channels, Henry would take the extraordinary step of making the cook's punishment a matter of parliamentary law. Henry VIII's response to the poisoning was swift and unprecedented. Rather than allowing Ruse to be tried through normal judicial processes, the king took the extraordinary step of having Parliament pass a special act specifically to address this case. The Act for Poisoning of 1531 declared poisoning to be high treason, a crime against the crown itself, and critically made this law retroactive so that it could be applied to Ruse's case despite the act not existing when the crime was committed. The act specified that Ruse was to be boiled alive, a punishment that had not previously been codified in English law. This method of execution was chosen deliberately for its horrific nature and symbolic significance. Poisoners worked through boiling pots and heated cauldrons. Now the instrument of their crime would become the instrument of their punishment. It was a grotesque application of the concept of poetic justice and a demonstration that the king could not only take life but could dictate the manner and meaning of death itself. The retroactive nature of the law was particularly troubling even by Tudor standards. It violated the principle that a person should be judged according to laws existing at the time of their offense, a concept recognized even in medieval jurisprudence. Yet Henry VIII was increasingly positioning himself as above traditional legal constraints. This case marked an important step in the king's assertion of his own supremacy over both common law and ecclesiastical authority, foreshadowing his later break with Rome and establishment as head of the Church of England. Parliament's willingness to pass such an extreme measure demonstrates how thoroughly that body had become an instrument of royal will. Although technically a legislative body representing the English people, by this point, Parliament functioned largely to give legal form to the king's desires. Few dared to oppose Henry directly, particularly on matters where he had expressed strong personal interest. The poisoning case, with its implications for royal security and the security of prominent households, clearly fell into this category. The act itself was written in language that left no doubt about the king's view of poisoning as a crime of special depravity. It described poisoning as detestable and noted that it had been little heretofore seen in England, suggesting it was a foreign practice now infecting the realm. This xenophobic undertone was typical of Tudor rhetoric, which often portrayed England as a virtuous nation threatened by corrupting outside influences. By framing poisoning in these terms, Henry was casting himself as a defender of English virtue against sinister foreign practices, a narrative that would serve him well in his later conflicts with Rome. On April 5, 1531, Richard Ruse was taken to Smithfield in London for his execution. A large crowd had gathered to witness this unusual spectacle, drawn by the notoriety of both the crime and its punishment. Public executions were common in Tudor England, serving as both entertainment and moral instruction for the populace. But this particular method was novel enough to attract special attention. The authorities would have encouraged attendance. The more witnesses to this demonstration of royal justice, the more effectively its message would spread. The execution apparatus was both simple and terrifying, a large cauldron or pot filled with water and heated until boiling. Unlike the more common methods of hanging or beheading, which could be relatively quick if properly conducted, boiling promised a prolonged and agonizing death. Some historical accounts suggest that Ruse was lowered into the water gradually rather than all at once, extending his suffering and the spectacle for the gathered crowd. Whether this was done by a mechanical device or by executioners using ropes is unclear from the historical record. Contemporary accounts of the execution are sparse, but indicate that Ruse suffered tremendously. The 16th-century chronicler Edward Hall wrote that Ruse roared mighty loud as he was being executed, his screams carrying across Smithfield and leaving an impression even on a crowd accustomed to public punishments. The physical effects would have been horrific, scalding water causing immediate and extensive burns leading to shock and eventually death from a combination of pain, heart failure, and internal injuries as the boiling water damaged tissues throughout the body. The witnesses to this gruesome spectacle would have included people from all walks of London life, merchants and labourers, clergy and craftsmen, possibly even nobility or court officials there to confirm that the king's will had been carried out. Their reactions are not recorded in detail, but even in a society far more accustomed to public violence than our own, this execution stood out for its cruelty. It was intended to shock and terrify, and by all accounts, it succeeded. After death, Ruse's body would have presented a grotesque sight with skin blistered and peeling, tissues partially cooked. What was done with his remains after the execution is not well documented. Common criminals' bodies were often denied proper burial, sometimes left on display as a warning or given to medical schools for anatomical study. As a traitor, Ruse's body might have been subjected to further indignities, though the specific post-mortem treatment is not clear from historical sources. The execution of Richard Ruse cast a long shadow over Tudor England. In the immediate aftermath, the Act for Poisoning remained on the books, establishing a precedent that poisoning was a crime of special magnitude deserving extraordinary punishment. While Ruse was the first person executed by boiling under Henry VIII law, he would not be the last. Historical records indicate that at least one woman, Margaret Davy, was boiled alive in 1542 for poisoning under the same statute, showing that the punishment was not a one-time spectacle, but an established, if rarely used, part of Tudor penal practice. For Bishop John Fisher, whose household had been the target of the poisoning, the incident added another layer of danger to his already precarious position. Fisher continued to oppose Henry's break with Rome and his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, a stance that would eventually lead to his beheading in 1535 after refusing to accept the Act of Supremacy. Some historians have speculated that the poisoning might have been an attempt to eliminate Fisher before his opposition became too problematic, though direct evidence for this theory is lacking. The Ruse case also demonstrates the extraordinary legal powers that Henry VIII was accumulating. The ability to have Parliament pass retroactive legislation targeting a specific individual showed how thoroughly traditional legal protections had eroded under Henry's rule. This pattern would continue and accelerate throughout the 1530s as Henry used parliamentary acts to reshape both religious and secular law according to his will, culminating in his break with Rome and establishment as supreme head of the Church of England. Public reaction to the execution is difficult to gauge precisely due to the limited nature of surviving records. However, the unique brutality of the punishment suggests it was intended to inspire not just fear, but a specific kind of horror. Poisoning was associated with secrecy, foreignness, and subversion, qualities that Henry increasingly attributed to his opponents, particularly those loyal to Rome. By punishing poisoning so spectacularly, Henry was symbolically asserting his power over all hidden threats to his authority. Internationally, the execution likely contributed to Henry's growing reputation for ruthlessness. European ambassadors regularly reported back to their courts about developments in England, and such an unusual punishment would certainly have been noteworthy. As Henry's break with Rome progressed, his willingness to use extreme methods against those he perceived as enemies became an important part of how he was viewed by both allies and opponents abroad. The practice of execution by boiling did not long outlive Henry VIII. His son Edward VI repealed the boiling statute in 1547, just 1 year after Henry's death. This change came as part of a broader revision of English treason law which had grown unwieldy and excessive during Henry's reign. While Edward's government was not necessarily more merciful overall, religious persecution continued, albeit with different targets. There seems to have been recognition that some of Henry's innovations in punishment had gone too far. The repeal of the boiling statute reflects changing sensibilities about appropriate punishment, even in an era we would still consider extremely harsh by modern standards. While executions remained public and often gruesome throughout the Tudor and Stuart periods, certain methods came to be seen as excessive or uncivilized. The evolution of punishment methods tells us something important about how societies draw and redraw the lines between acceptable and unacceptable violence, even when operating within frameworks that accepted state-sanctioned killing as normal. For modern historians, the case of Richard Ruse offers valuable insights into Tudor governance and justice. It demonstrates the personal nature of Tudor rule, how the king's will could rapidly become law, how punishment was shaped by royal preoccupations, and how legal principles could be subordinated to political necessity. The case stands as a stark example of how power operated in a system where the boundaries between personal royal authority and state governance were often blurred or non-existent. The execution also highlights the period's complex relationship with poison as both crime and concept. Poison was feared not just as a method of murder, but as a metaphor for hidden corruption and foreign influence. As Henry VIII broke with Rome and established himself as head of the English Church, the idea of poisoning, of hidden agents working to undermine the health of the body politic, became increasingly potent. Ruse's punishment was designed not just to deter other potential poisoners, but to symbolically purge the realm of corrupting influences. In medical terms, the Tudor understanding of poison was still heavily influenced by medieval concepts of humors and contamination. Without modern toxicology, the line between food that had simply gone bad and food that had been deliberately tampered with was not always clear. This ambiguity may have contributed to the sense of special horror surrounding poisoning cases. They combined the terror of murder with uncertainty about its causes and origins, making poisoning seem particularly sinister and unnatural. The legacy of Richard Ruse's execution extends well beyond its immediate historical context. For legal historians, the case represents a significant example of *ex post facto law, legislation that criminalizes actions retroactively. This principle, that no one should be punished for actions that were not illegal when committed, is now enshrined in many modern legal systems, including the United States Constitution. The Ruse case stands as a cautionary tale about what happens when this principle is violated for political expediency. For students of Tudor politics, the execution illuminates the complex factional struggles surrounding Henry VIII's break with Rome. Bishop Fisher, in whose household the poisoning occurred, represented the conservative Catholic faction opposing Henry's divorce. While no direct connection has been proven between the poisoning and these larger political conflicts, the context cannot be ignored. The king's personal involvement in the case and the extraordinary punishment decreed suggests that more was at stake than simple criminal justice. The method of execution, boiling alive, also has significance for understanding the symbolic dimensions of Tudor punishment. Executions were never just about eliminating criminals. They were elaborate performances that communicated messages about power, justice, and the social order. The punishment often mirrored the crime in a form of theatrical justice. Traitors were drawn and quartered because they had symbolically divided the kingdom. Heretics were burned because their ideas were thought to consume the body of Christ like fire. Poisoners were boiled because they had used cooking implements to commit their crimes, creating a grim poetic justice. Psychologically, the choice of such an extreme punishment reveals something about the particular fears and anxieties of the Tudor mind. Poisoning represented a special kind of horror because it turned the everyday necessity of eating into a potential death sentence. It could strike anyone regardless of status or strength and often left no obvious trace. In a society deeply concerned with hierarchy and proper order, poisoning represented a subversive threat that could undermine even the most carefully structured power relations. The rarity of the punishment, used only a handful of times in English history, also suggests its exceptional nature. Even in a society that routinely employed hanging, burning, and beheading as punishments, boiling was considered extreme. This tells us something important about how societies establish gradations of punishment and how certain crimes come to be seen as requiring exceptional measures. The very extremity of the punishment hints at the deep anxiety poisoning provoked in Tudor society. The story of Richard Ruse resonates with modern audiences partly because it sits at the intersection of several enduring human concerns: the limits of state power, the relationship between crime and punishment, and the use of terror as a political tool. In an age when governments around the world still employ cruel and unusual punishments, Ruse's execution serves as a reminder of how easily justice can become a spectacle of state power rather than a search for truth or proportional response. The personal involvement of Henry VIII in the case also speaks to perennial questions about the rule of law versus the rule of men. The king's ability to create a special law targeting a specific individual highlights the dangers when too much power concentrates in the hands of one person. Constitutional governments and separation of powers exist precisely to prevent such arbitrary exercises of authority. Yet even in modern democracies, we still struggle with questions about executive power and its limits. The public nature of Tudor punishment also invites comparison with modern media treatments of crime and punishment. While we no longer gather in town squares to watch executions, violent crime and its consequences remain staples of news coverage and entertainment. The human fascination with the macabre and the punitive appears to be a constant across cultures and centuries, though its expressions change with technology and social norms. For contemporary readers, the medical aspects of Ruse's case are particularly striking. The difficulty in Tudor times of distinguishing between accidental food poisoning and deliberate contamination reminds us how much our understanding of the world has been transformed by scientific advancement. Without modern forensic toxicology, many innocent people throughout history may have been condemned as poisoners when deaths were actually due to natural contamination or disease. Finally, the Ruse execution serves as a stark reminder of how far our conceptions of appropriate punishment have evolved. While debate continues about capital punishment in many jurisdictions, there is now broad international consensus against torture and cruel punishments. The execution of Richard Ruse represents a moment in history when pain was not just an incidental aspect of punishment, but its central purpose, a concept largely rejected by modern justice systems, at least in principle, if not always in practice. As we conclude our examination of Richard Ruse's execution, we're left with more questions than answers. Was he truly guilty of attempted murder? Or was he merely the perpetrator of a prank gone horribly wrong? Was he acting alone or was he a pawn in larger political machinations? The historical record is insufficient to provide definitive answers, leaving room for continued speculation and research by historians fascinated by this grim episode. What is clear is that his execution stands as a striking example of how justice has been conceptualized and administered throughout history. From the retroactive law that condemned him to the public spectacle of his death, every aspect of Ruse's case illuminates the vast differences between Tudor jurisprudence and modern legal principles. Yet, it also reveals certain continuities: the use of punishment as communication, the relationship between crime and political power, and the human tendency to reserve special horror for crimes that subvert the ordinary and expected order of daily life. Henry VIII England was a realm in transition, moving from medieval concepts of justice and kingship toward the more centralized state power that would characterize later periods. The Ruse case, with its Parliamentary Act and royal intervention, represents an important step in this evolution. It shows a monarch increasingly willing to use novel legal mechanisms to assert his authority, foreshadowing the more dramatic religious and political changes that would soon transform England entirely. For modern viewers looking back at this disturbing chapter of history, Richard Ruse's execution serves as both warning and perspective. It warns us about the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for cruelty when legal principles are subordinated to political expediency. But it also provides perspective on our own era, reminding us how far we have come in our concepts of justice and human rights while challenging us to recognize where we might still fall short of our ideals. The boiling cauldron at Smithfield has long since cooled. But the questions it raises about justice, power, and humanity continue to simmer through the centuries. Richard Ruse, a man who might otherwise have been forgotten by history, instead became a symbol of an era's brutality and a case study in the evolution of punishment. His terrible end, ordered by a king whose name would become synonymous with tyrannical excess, reminds us why the restraint of power and the protection of legal principles matter in every age, including our own.